Well, that's some bonus content that we can discuss and bleep names out of as necessary.
Well, can you please take out the part where I say
Absolutely, I could do that. So I've just spent 10 minutes talking to my guest all about a thing that we both have in common, which is our love of singing, which may give you a clue as to who my guest is today, but also should give you some incentive to go over to the Patreon and check out the conversation we had about that time I sung in the Tabernacle Choir and just hear us chat a little bit of nonsense about music more generally. My guest today is, of course, the illustrious Jim Bennett. Jim, welcome.
thank you? I didn't realize I was illustrious, but I'm happy to be as illustrious as possible.
Definitely, and we've just recorded an episode together in recent days with Ian for your podcast, Inside
Mhm.
Out, and so we touched on the topic of prophetic fallibility, and we
Yes.
touched on that through a very interesting sort of rubric designed by Ian, where we span a wheel and talked
Yeah.
about it through different sort of we approached the topic through different framing devices, through different scenarios. But I wanted to have a conversation with you more broadly about prophetic fallibility, infallibility, what it means for the church, and get it a little bit deeper into that in a sort of long form episode, give people an opportunity to really get into it. So let's start with some of the thoughts you've been having around prophetic fallibility and infallibility.
Well, I've written a book that I don't know if I'm ever going to publish. Eventually, I'll probably self-publish it if I can't get anybody to actually put it to press. But it's called "Fallibility: A Love Story," which the whole premise of it and the whole thesis of it is that I don't think it's enough for the church to just say, oh, yes, leaders are fallible and leaders can make mistakes. I don't even think it's enough for them to say leaders can make doctrinal mistakes, because one of the biggest mistakes we make when we talk about fallibility is that we talk about it in terms of sort of errors. The idea that, oh, okay, well, yeah, the president of the church could forget your birthday, but the president of the church can never, ever say anything in a pulpit that is not doctrinally correct. And that's really kind of nonsense. And it's belied by scripture, ancient and modern, and it's belied by the whole history of the church. And I think the way forward is to sort of embrace the idea in a way that I think our theology allows for, in ways that a lot more mainstream Christianity and Christian churches don't allow for, which is the idea that fallibility and agency, because agency and infallibility are completely incompatible. If you can't make a mistake, that means you're not capable of making that choice, which means your agency has been extracted from you somehow. And that never happens, regardless of what calling you have.
I believe that was Lucifer's plan, right? Was to strip us of that ability to make mistakes.
That was Lucifer's plan. Exactly. I think the way forward is not only to acknowledge, yes, we've made some mistakes and we've made some doozies. I mean, we haven't just made small mistakes. I think arguably the biggest mistakes we could talk about are race in the priesthood and polygamy. But you know, we have a theology that begins with the idea of what's often termed the fortunate fall. The rest of the Christian world believes that Adam and Eve made this terrible, tragic error, or did this terrible, awful thing. And so this fallen world is all as a result of a tragedy. Whereas we talk about the idea like, well, Adam and Eve, Adam fell that men might be, men are that they might have joy. This idea that the fall was necessary in order to be able to allow us to learn the good from the evil for ourselves. And the way you do that is by making mistakes, is by screwing up. I spent forever, I talked about this a few times when I was an early morning seminary teacher. I used to have this very heretical idea about the fall, in that I did not believe in the idea of conflicting commandments. And one of the things that people talk about is, okay, well, they were given these two commandments. One of them was multiply and replenish the earth, but they couldn't do that unless they were mortal. and the other commandment was don't partake of the fruit. And so they chose the higher law, and isn't that great? And that makes the fall wonderful. And I'm like, well, what about 1 Nephi 3:7? I will go and do the things the Lord hath commanded, for he giveth no commandment unto the children of men, save he shall prepare a way for them to accomplish the thing which he had commanded. And I thought the idea that, okay, he said to Adam, multiply and replenish the earth, and like, we're trying everything and none of it's working. That doesn't make any sense to me. And I had taught that in a Sunday school class with all of the kids that were in my seminary class. And parents actually wrote up this letter saying, please make sure you teach the correct doctrine of the church. It was a big scandal at the moment. And I was 24 or 5 or something like that.
So you've always been getting into trouble, Jim. That's what we're saying?
I have always been getting into trouble. I've always been a heretic. But since then, I have completely reinterpreted the fall, because I no longer see it as something that happened to someone else, and I don't want to necessarily get into whether or not there was a historical Adam and Eve and all that stuff, because that's where all of that was grounded before, and none of that really matters to me at this point. The idea is the fall is the story of every person that enters mortality, because every person makes the decision to separate themselves from the presence of God and come to a fallen world and come and learn by their own experience the good from the evil. It's everybody's individual story.
So it's an allegory for everyone's experience coming to mortality.
Yes,
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. And so if that's the case, and you sort of look at it that way, then all of a sudden, not only should we allow for the reality that the church is going to make errors, we should expect it. We should expect that as part of mortality. And the idea, this is also the whole idea of sustaining leaders. We use the word sustain because it's a word that implies weakness on the part of somebody that you're sustaining. If somebody needs help, somebody needs to be sustained, it's because they're weak and they need your support. So it's, I think, a greater act of faith to sustain a church leader who gets things wrong.
But the problem there is Henry B. Eyring would say that it is a sin that we must repent of to think of weaknesses in those that we have pledged to sustain.
1. Have I thought or spoken of the human weaknesses in the people I have pledged to sustain? Those questions will, for most of us, lead to some uneasiness and a need to repent.
So the idea of framing sustaining as we sustain them because we recognize they're weak, well, those that are asking for us to sustain them are telling us that, no, you shouldn't think of us as weak. That's not what sustaining means.
I understand that. I understand that. Part of this, too, is that if I'm going to talk about prophetic fallibility, it means that you're going to bump up against statements by leaders that you don't agree with. Sustain, nowhere will you find a thesaurus that has the word agree as a synonym for sustain. Sustaining leaders does not necessarily mean agreeing with them.
So because we are going to, I think, encounter a lot of contradictions in terms of the way that leaders of the church want these words to be seen versus what they should mean or what theologically they could mean. So I think it's going to be important to kind of pass those differences. One of the things I do want to get into specifically here is it is often a complaint when someone like Uchtdorf, for example, admits that church leaders have made mistakes. And I'm sure that quote will come up. And particularly even when church leaders will say that they, so-and-so in this story they're telling a conference, so-and-so had doubts. And then they don't say what they were. So many times I find myself yelling at the screen, just say the thing.
Right.
Say the thing that happened. And so similarly here, we're going to talk about leaders of the church making mistakes. You've already said they made some doozies, and I don't want to fall into that trap of just saying they made mistakes and then not naming them.
And not name. That's the thing, is it's like even with President Uchtdorf, he doesn't name what any of those mistakes were.
And to be perfectly frank, there have been times when members or leaders in the church have simply made mistakes.
So should we get into naming them?
Well, if you'd like.
I think just as not every single one, obviously, but as an overview, as some examples of errors and mistakes that have been made. So for me, for example, I would view the ban on black members having the priesthood and entering the temple to be a huge mistake for the church, and something that wasn't supported by doctrine. What I don't think was even particularly supported by revelation. It's something that came to Brigham Young, he started, and then no one knew how to undo for a long time. That's my view on it.
Yeah, it's my view as well. The church has come right up to the line of admitting that it was a mistake. I mean, it's disavowed everything.
Well, they've disavowed it.
It's disavowed everything it's ever said about it. It's disavowed. I mean, I was taught that black people bear the curse of Cain. It wasn't a folk doctrine. I have a cousin who served a mission in Brazil and was serving a mission at the time when the revelation was received. And he talked about the fact that the mark of Cain discussion that the mission in Brazil had come up with, he was so grateful when they no longer had to start teaching that, because in Brazil at the time, and it's one of the reasons why the ban was lifted, they had a temple in Brazil, and there are so many different racial lineages, and people had to go out of their way. President McKay had changed it so that it used to be that you had to prove that you didn't have one drop. And he sort of reversed that and said, assume you don't have any, unless somebody can prove that you do have one drop of African. I mean, it's just garbage and nonsense, and it always was. Brigham Young didn't invent it. Brigham Young sort of adopted it because it was a common Protestant justification for American slavery. And so he
brought it to the church, I guess is my point, right? He made it.
He brought it into the church. But he didn't come up with the idea. He just sort of ported it in unexamined. And I think one of the reasons why it endured, there are a number of reasons why it endured. One is that it wasn't out of step with the rest of the world for a very long time. I mean, I don't think that any prophet until maybe, I don't know if anybody before David O. McKay, but probably David O. McKay is the first one who starts to go, this is really out of step with the world at large. And we're looking more and more bigoted as a result of this. And so I think he was one of the first people to actually start questioning it. But you know, I was raised, David O. McKay is my great-grandfather, and I was raised with family stories about how David O. McKay hated the priesthood ban and wanted to lift the priesthood ban so desperately. But the Lord kept telling him no. And so that was kind of my apologetic explanation for, well, of course it was of God, because David O. McKay didn't want it to reverse. And then I read Greg Prince's magnificent biography of President McKay, David O. McKay and the Rise of Modern Mormonism, and discovered my great-grandfather was a segregationist. And I'm like, well, if you're a segregationist, then whatever it was you were praying for wasn't full equality. I mean, it was very clear he did not see black people as equal to white people. And so, you know, I think there are, it just becomes clearer and clearer and clearer that this was a mistake. And every other explanation just falls flat, and all the gyrations you have to do in order to protect Brigham Young from accusations of racism require you to attribute terrible, bigoted racism to God. I'd much prefer to accept that Brigham Young is a racist than that the creator of the universe is a racist.
Because I think some of this does come down to, they claim to speak for God. We could probably even insert the clip here of Russell M. Nelson saying it to a group of primary children in a log cabin.
Do you know what the word prophet means? He speaks for God. And so God won't lead you astray, and the prophet will not lead you astray.
You've got the prophet claiming that they don't speak to God, they don't commune with God, they speak for him.
Well, they imply that they
That's
commune with God.
right. They
They
imply
want
the
you to
other
think
parts
that,
around it.
yeah, but I mean, when push comes to shove, they admit that they don't have personal priesthood interviews on a regular basis in the Holy of Holies with the
But they
saints.
claim that the words they speak are God's words. Whether
Yeah.
by my own voice or the voice of my servants, it is the same. They're backing that.
Which we can get into that, because that scripture does not mean what people think it means.
But it's being taken to mean that when when it comes into contact with statements like the one we just heard from Russell M. Nelson, where he says that he speaks for God,
Right.
you know, that becomes very easy then to interpret it in that light. And
Right.
so what we end up with is a question of, is God then saying these things that are deeply problematic? Is God just changing his mind about the November 2015 policy? Is it revelation when he tells them to do it and then revelation when they reverse it? Was God really being racist and bigoted throughout the priesthood and temple ban for black members of the church? Is God really that interested in lying to the SEC? Is that what God wants?
It's the Kevin Hamilton thing.
Yeah, that's a question you have to ask. Yeah, because is it Kevin Hamilton that says replace the name the church with the Lord or Jesus Christ?
As I visit with members across the church, I sometimes hear things like, I don't support the church's policy on, and then you fill in the blank. Or, I don't agree with the way the church does this or that. Could I suggest an alternative approach? Substitute the word Savior or Lord or Jesus Christ in place of the church. As in, I don't support the Savior's policy on, you fill in the blank. Or I don't agree with the way Jesus Christ does this or that. For me, personally, that seems to put a very different perspective on things.
Right. So Jesus Christ hid money
Hid
with
money
the
from
shell
the
company.
SEC and was fined by them for $5 million, right?
Right.
So that is a question. I think fundamentally that will change your approach to this conversation that we're having. If you believe God is like that, then what we say is not, I don't think, going to have any sway on you, because you can just blame God for the priesthood ban. You can just blame him for everything. But if you believe in a version of God that isn't that way and does love all his children and doesn't discriminate and looketh not upon the outward appearance but upon the heart, if that's your version of God, then you have to ask whether it is God indeed that allowed the priesthood ban or whether it's prophets making mistakes. And given that God's characteristic is generally one of infallibility, and that's a much easier position to defend for an omnipotent being and an omniscient being, then I think the humans that claim to speak for him are probably going to be the weak link in the chain. Your thoughts there, Jim?
No, exactly. I mean, the thing is, we act like this is some kind of mass departure from how God has dealt with his children throughout history. I mean, you read the Old Testament particularly, these are deeply, deeply flawed people that are discussed in the Old Testament. I mean, I look at Jacob, Israel. I mean, this is a guy who tricks his brother out of a birthright and deceives. I mean, you look at King David. I mean, he's probably the most prominent example, but he's not the only one.
Jonah refused to go to Nineveh where he was meant to go.
Well, and the other thing is that I don't think that the story of Jonah is ancient journalism. I mean, I think we read the Old Testament. Do you know who Ben Spackman is?
Nope.
Ben Spackman, a brilliant scholar, and he's done his PhD on the whole idea of reconciling evolution
Mm-hmm.
with the gospel, and so he talks about genre. He's like when, for instance, if you were to go to somebody and say, okay, well, is Much Ado About Nothing by William Shakespeare literal or figurative? You'd look at him and say, what are you talking about? It's fiction. And you'd say, exactly. We have different rules and understanding of different genres of writing. And a play written in Elizabethan England is a different genre than scripture written by ancient Hebrews, and there are so many different genres in the Old Testament. And the idea that we take them and say, okay, well, this is journalism. I mean, Joseph Fielding Smith particularly saw scripture as this is sort of a journalistic account of something that happened. And none of the writers of the Old Testament would have even considered doing it that way. I mean, it's very clear, for instance, that the book of Job is a tone poem. The idea that somebody sat there and was transcribing all of the things Job's friends were saying to him is absolute nonsense. This is a exploration, a literary explanation of why bad things happen to good people. I don't think it's a very satisfying one. But that's another story.
It's an attempt. But no, I think you're right. And I think that certainly a contributing factor to the idea that members of the church aren't very good at viewing the Bible poetically is partly because of the way that we're taught to view the Bible in many ways as just the literal word of God. We believe the Bible to be the word of God, right? As far as it's translated
that's changing slowly.
I think so.
But I think you're right.
The fact that we have this weird aversion to Songs of Solomon doesn't help, because if you were to read Songs of Solomon, you would start to see the poeticism of biblical text more. I think it's because it's a very obvious example of it.
Yeah, but it talks about boobs and stuff.
It does, unfortunately, and that doesn't fit with the very sort of puritanical Mormon views of the world. So it's a shame.
So no, but I mean, this is the whole issue: is that if you expect human error, I mean, the fact is, again, you come back to the central core of the theology and the idea that we separated from God in order to be able to use our own judgment and stumble around. And so many members of the church and leaders of the church, frankly, say, no, well, we separated from God so that then we could use the answer key, which is the prophet. We don't have to make any moral judgments ourselves. We wait for the prophet to tell us what we should do and what's right and what's wrong.
When the prophet speaks, sisters, the debate is over.
Personal opinions may vary. Eternal principles never do. When the prophet speaks, sisters, the debate is over.
Yeah, it just defeats the whole purpose of what we came here to do. And then everybody says, well, okay, then that means prophets are useless. And it's like, no, I don't think that means that at all.
No, it means that they should be spiritual guides to a group of people. That's how in my head, that's the role that prophets should fulfill, which is why it's an issue that they are essentially lawyers and businessmen, because it means they lack the sort of requisite skills to lead and to sort of lead spiritually. What they know how to do is manage. It's Nibley's leaders managers talk.
Yeah,
absolutely coming true. It's possible that's possibly the most prophetic thing that's been uttered by a modern leader of the church, is what Nibley said about leaders and managers and how we've seen that take over the leadership structure of the church. Is these people who know how to manage a large organization very well. They know how to try and command obedience from people underneath them to do what they say in order to, keep the cohesion of the organization. And what we lose is the spiritual guidance, the pastoral guidance, all those things that are actually there that nourish the soul of the church.
No, I think you're right. And it's, so David O. McKay is my great-grandfather on my mother's side. Heber J. Grant is my great-grandfather on my father's side.
Anyone else? Do we want to get anyone else out there now that
that's
you're
it? That's
from?
Well, Daniel H. Wells, who was I'm steeped in all. I used to tell my Gentile friends that I was descended from 2 Mormon popes.
Nice.
And which popes don't have descendants, so that doesn't really work very well. But Heber J. Grant, again with the family stories, Heber J. Grant did not consider himself a prophet. He was not a particularly pastoral sort of guy. He was very much a manager, and he considered himself president of the church and considered the presidency of the church to be a managerial position. He hated the song, "We Thank Thee, O God, for a Prophet," because he's like, the prophet was Joseph Smith. I'm just the president of the church. There was a sort of humility to that, I think. But it was David O. McKay again, my other great-grandfather, who really sort of cranked up the no, we're prophets. I'm a prophet. I'm the prophet, and was the most recent guy to sort of start that up again since Joseph Smith. And you see sort of a variation in how presidents of the church view that role.
Yeah, well, like Hinckley backed right off from it, didn't he? When
Hinckley
confronted
backed
with it.
way away from it. New name Noah. I remember having a conversation with him. Do you know him?
Yeah.
Mike Norton. Yeah. He says his shelf broke when he watched Gordon B. Hinckley on Larry King, and Larry King said, "Well, aren't you a prophet?" And he said, "Well, I am sustained as such." And new name Noah thought, well, if you're a prophet, own it and embrace it. And President Hinckley really was very uncomfortable with that. And one of the ways you could see that too is that whenever President Hinckley would walk into a room, as is the case with all prophets, and it drives me crazy because I think this is an act of worship, not an act of respect, when everybody stands up. And the prophet walks into the room and everybody stands up and is silent until the prophet gets to his chair. And I was in the conference center many times when President Hinckley would come in, and he would be almost embarrassed, and he'd almost run to the chair and be like, sit down, everybody sit down. And then while I've been in the choir, the president of the church has been Russell Nelson, and he comes in and everybody stands up, and he would sort of walk and he'd stop and maybe talk to somebody on his way to his chair. And I'd be standing there and I'd be like, could you please sit down so that we can all sit down?
Yeah, he kind of basked in it a little bit. He really basked in the attention.
Yeah, he very much was, I am the prophet and I speak for God. And I mean, I can't imagine President Hinckley in that log cabin doing that same thing with those primary children. I think President Hinckley was very uncomfortable with that.
How many times did we hear the phrase "our beloved prophet" being used to refer to Russell M. Nelson? He seemed to be, so it will be interesting to see how Down Lane Jokes approaches this.
Well, it will be
less inclined.
I'm seeing actually, it's been really remarkable because I've seen him now in person. I sang at the memorial service for President Nelson. I did not sing at the funeral. There were two different things. There was a memorial service just days after, and they just sort of jerry-rigged something quickly. And then the funeral was much more elaborate, and I wasn't able to go sing at that. But when President Oaks walked in the room, in the tabernacle, this was in the tabernacle, everybody stood up. And President Oaks was like, no. Like almost it was, I'm not president of the church yet. I don't know if that's what it was. But he was very kind of, no, let's not do that. I get this, as soon as somebody is in the big chair, and Greg Prince talks about this all the time, something changes. Greg Prince likes to talk about the fact that President Kimball used to say he was the greatest follower in the church. And then when he became president of the church, there was nobody to follow. And all of a sudden it's, oh, well, geesh, okay. And, I think President Oaks, you have been seeing him sort of wrestle with a lot of these things. The whole idea of trying to find ways to justify excluding LGBT people. He came up with this, okay, well, there's this big conflict between the first and second great commandment, and ran with that, and that went over like a lead balloon. And he backed away from it. He's now said, no, it's now more important that we live those two commandments fully together, which I think I think they're the same commandment. I think the way we show our love for God is by loving our neighbor. I don't think there's
in as much as you've done it unto the least of these, my brethren, you've done it unto me. That's the scripture, right?
Right. Well, in Book of Mormon, when you are in the service of your fellow beings, you're only in the service of your God. I mean, just on. So he went to this idea of, he gave a talk where he said, well, look, the church is all about the celestial kingdom. We're trying to get you to the highest level. But and of course, LGBT people won't be able to get there. But look at these other two kingdoms; they're not bad, So that's pretty good, right? And that didn't satisfy anybody, I mean, and so then you have. I know you have big problems with some of the things that he said at the University of Virginia. But it was at the University of Virginia where he also said maybe we need to start living with the fact that gay marriage is the law of the land. And maybe we have to stop trying to overturn that and figure out how to live with that. And that's when the church endorsed the Respect for Marriage Act in the United States. So, I mean, the caricature of President Oaks as this sort of rigid, um, just dyed in the wool bigot. I don't think that holds up to scrutiny. I think he's a whole lot more thoughtful than that. I do think that there is sort of this unchallenged assumption at the core, this idea that, well, we can never really fully embrace LGBT people, so there must be some way around it. And I think he's sort of discovering maybe. I think I think we're going to be very surprised.
Okay, well, I remain hopeful for that. I think in my last video, I covered the fact that he said we do not seek apologies nor do we give them as a church. And again, refusing to admit error. I've talked about the idea that when it comes to prophets, there's this saying that, members of the church don't think the prophet is infallible. Of course not. We know he's fallible. But I would always challenge people to ask a member of the church for an example of that fallibility. Then tell me a time they got it wrong, and they won't. And refusing to acknowledge that and functioning that puts you in a position of essentially functioning as though they are infallible. You're functioning as though they can do no wrong because you're unwilling to acknowledge any wrong they might do. And that also comes with when they say they won't apologize when they get things wrong. Again, that speaks to functionally being the same as, well, if we will never admit that we do something wrong, if we will never apologize for it, then essentially we don't do anything wrong.
Right.
That would be the view there. And so does Oakes view himself as infallible, do you think?
I absolutely don't think he does.
Okay.
I mean, I know a lot of people who know. So we know we have a family friend that is very close friends with Kristen Oakes, which is his second wife, and we heard firsthand the story of their courtship. That was really kind of bizarre. They met each other in Liberty Park in Salt Lake City. She had written a letter saying, "I want to meet you," and she actually was friends with Elder Ballard, and Elder Ballard got the letter and gave it to President Oakes, and they met in Liberty Park and with chaperones. I mean, it was this big, huge. Anyway, I don't know why I'm wandering off on that tangent, but the reality is that people who talk to him personally, particularly up close and personal, talk about how humble and self-effacing he is. That when he stands up at a pulpit and is sort of this legal scholar, which is the way he presents, he sort of masks that, although I think that mask slipped, particularly in this last conference. He seems so much more vulnerable to me and so much more human when he starts talking about the loss of his father and starts talking about, I mean, I think now that there really isn't anybody else to impress, that he's the guy out on the ledge, that I think you're going to see the real Dallin Oakes in a way that I think will be received positively.
So then do you think we could receive, he would be willing to apologize on behalf of the church for something? Because
I don't know.
if he believes he leads a church that does not seek apologies nor does it give them, he's now in charge of that, which means that he is the ultimate one that makes those decisions. And when those decisions turn out to be something that perhaps would need to be an apology made for, he's put himself in a position where he says, well, we don't apologize. So then he is going to have to, in some way, think of himself as infallible, even if he doesn't, on a personal level, think of himself that way. When he is acting in his capacity as leader of the church, he must view himself as infallible. Otherwise, why would he be unwilling to apologize?
See, I think he's smarter than that.
Okay.
I don't think he can convince himself that he is infallible. I think he is well aware of how fallible he is. But I do think he's trying very hard. Okay, so how do I reconcile that with this hard line that I've taken? Are you a Star Trek fan?
Somewhat.
Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country.
Right. No, you've lost me there.
Oh, okay. It's the last movie with the original cast with William Shatner and all those guys. And it's the movie, it was described as the movie where the Berlin Wall comes down in space. The Federation makes peace with the Klingons. And they send Captain Kirk off to do it, even though Captain Kirk hates the Klingons. And they set that up in a way that made William Shatner very angry because it made Captain Kirk look like a bigot. But anyway, there's a line in that movie where Captain Kirk is being assigned to go and make overtures to the Klingon Empire. And Spock says to him, there is an old Vulcan proverb, only Nixon could go to China. So that brings up Nixon, Richard Nixon, and this is quite American, so I don't know why the Vulcans thought so. But Richard Nixon made his career prior to being president by being this hardline anti-communist. He prosecuted Alger Hiss that got him on the map, and he was just the most anti-communist person in the world. And so when it's Richard Nixon who opens the door to communist China, it has tremendous credibility with everybody because if Nixon thinks this is a good idea, then we need to take it seriously, even all the hardcore anti-communists. I look at President Oaks and wonder if we're being set up for a Nixon to China moment.
So because he's been so anti-apology,
because he's been so rigid and so outspoken on this, that if he were the one to open the door for greater inclusion, and again, I'm not going to say, I don't know what that looks like. I'm not saying, I don't think temple ceilings for gay couples are in the future. I don't see that. Certainly not happening with President Oaks. But whatever happens, he has been sort of, whether you realize it or not, he's been at the forefront of all of the moves towards greater inclusion, such as the Respect for Marriage Act. That wouldn't have happened if it weren't for Dallin Oaks. So if he were the one to come out and say, okay, the Lord wants us to be more inclusive, and here's how we're going to do it, he would have so much more credibility on that front than, say, Dieter Uchtdorf would.
Yeah, because everyone would expect it coming from him.
Yeah. So,
and it would seem like it's his personal thing rather than from the Lord, because you would think to yourself, okay, well, if Oaks is saying that and we know how he's spoken, then that must be coming as revelation, because it's not what he would do naturally. The issue there is, why was he ever speaking out on behalf of the church about these things, not speaking for the Lord? And that would be the question. And then the tension again arises that if they're speaking for God and they're leading the church through revelation, then why now? Why now does God go, okay, it's time for greater inclusion? Why in 1978 does God go, okay, right now it's time to stop treating black people as second-class members of the church? Now it's time to allow them to be sealed to their families and enjoy exaltation like everybody else. Now it's time for that. Why wasn't it time before? Do you either blame God and say, well, it's all in God's timing, or do you blame the leaders and call them fallible? And I think that brings that tension to the surface again.
Yeah. Well, and if I have to throw anybody under the bus, I'm going to throw fallible people rather than God. Why does God allow this kind of thing? Why does God allow this kind of error to endure? I'm sure you're familiar with Daniel Peterson.
Tape It Dan.
I actually quite like Daniel Peterson, and I think
I have no personal opinion of him,
Yeah.
I have an opinion on some of the things he said about horses.
Oh, well, I'm not going to get into that, but I am going to get into. He hosted a discussion on his Facebook page about the possibility of the priesthood ban being an error,
Okay.
and he said, "I am open to the idea that the initial ban was an error, but I am not open to the idea that it could have endured that long without God stepping in." And I think that's part of the problem for a lot of people is that, okay, well, how do these errors continue, and why doesn't God step in? Why doesn't God? And the best answer to that, or the best framework to look at that, I think, comes from Paul Reeve. Do you know who Paul Reeve is?
No. You hang
Paul
out with
Reeve.
some cool people that I don't know, Jim.
Oh, well, that's all right. Paul Reeve, actually, he's probably the best scholar in the world when it comes to racial issues in the church. He is a professor at the University of Utah, and he's an active, faithful member of the church. And the church came to him, or Deseret Book came to him anyway. And they have produced a series of books that are really kind of pamphlets. And it's the Let's Talk About series. Let's talk about polygamy. Let's talk about the translation of the Book of Mormon. Let's talk about, so it just goes through all of these difficult issues.
Like the Gospel Topics essay tried to.
Yeah, actually, Paul Reeve was one of the principal authors of the Race and the Priesthood essay.
Well, it's nice to be able to put an author to it because,
Yeah,
these things were authorless, but...
Yeah. So there really are kind of expansions on those. And they came to him and they said, "We want you to write this book called Race and Let's Talk About Race and the Priesthood." And he said, "Well, all right, but here are my conditions. I am not going to write this book if I'm not allowed to say that the priesthood ban was a mistake." He's like, the whole history, he says, I have to address Brigham Young's 1852 speech to the Utah Territorial Legislature, which is where this really all originated. I mean, the exclusions against black people were sporadic and local until that address. And then Brigham Young just sort of codified it to
borrow a phrase. Yeah.
But he codified the idea that these black people they bear the curse of Cain. They will never get the priesthood until all of the descendants of Abel get the priesthood. And I don't even Abel had any descendants. I mean, wasn't he killed before he got married?
I believe he was killed. I don't know whether he had any children.
I don't know how that all works. But so he says, "I'm not going to write this book unless you let me say it was a mistake." And they said, "Write the book." So Deseret Book with the, and this is long and winding. So I'm trying to figure out a way to make it punchier. But he wrote a book called Religion of a Different Color. And he talks about the idea that editorial cartoons mocking Mormon polygamy would show Brigham Young standing there with all of his daughters, and all of his daughters were all of different races, including one who was very identifiably black. These editorial cartoons were in some way depicting Mormons as a separate race, that Mormons weren't even considered, white people, which was very problematic around the time of the Civil War, when racial issues really were about denigrating certain people as being almost subhuman, that black people weren't really fully human. And in fact, the United States Constitution talked about them as being, they're 3/5 of a person. They're not a full person. So Paul Reeve's idea is that the priesthood ban, to a large degree, was Brigham Young sort of reasserting the whiteness and the Americanness of members of the church. And he compares it, and this is I think the best comparison here. He compares it to the Old Testament story of Samuel, where the children of Israel come to Samuel and say, "We want a king. We want to be like other nations. We want a king." And Samuel goes to the Lord and says, if you have a king, all these terrible things are going to happen. Having a king is an awful thing to do, and the king is going to become corrupt, and everything's going to be awful. You don't want a king. And then Samuel goes back to the children of Israel and says, this is what God says. We shouldn't have a king. And they say, no, no, no. We want a king. We want to be like other nations. And then he goes back to the Lord, and the Lord helps him pick a king. After saying, you shouldn't have a king, don't have a king, don't do this. But he comes back and says, no, 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 we really want to do this. So God helps him pick a king, even when he said you shouldn't have one. And Israel had a king for hundreds of years, longer than they had, than the priesthood ban was in place. And it ended up destroying Israel, destroying the nation of Israel, because the king, so the point being that if the Book of Mormon talks about this too, in the book of Jacob, chapter 4, talks about the Jews who look beyond the mark, and because they desired it, God hath done it, that they may stumble. So Paul Reeve, and this is kind of how I've adopted this. Paul Reeve says, look, this is what we wanted. We wanted to be white, and we wanted to be accepted by the United States. We wanted to be like other nations. And this is the way we did it. And God said, okay, well, if that's what you want, then that's what you're going to get. And you're going to get the consequences from that ye may stumble. And so then you say, well, why didn't he lift it? I come back to that story I told earlier about President McKay is, okay, we want to lift the priesthood ban, God. And here's what we want. We want it lifted so that they can, but we certainly don't want interracial marriage. We certainly don't want them to be equal to white people.
Yeah, we don't want them coming to BYU.
We don't want them coming to BYU, just on and on and on. We still, and the answer is, nope, that isn't it.
Because if you're going to have them in, they're going to be equal.
You want to lift this, you're going to lift this. They are going to be equal. I mean, I think that's the answer that David O. McKay and other people were getting was, no, that I'm not going to do that. You either take the whole enchilada or you don't get any of it.
Well, I'm going to take some time to sit with that, because that is a really interesting framing of how it was allowed to go on. But ultimately, then, what we are looking at is, in the same way as Martin Harris taking home the pages against everyone's wishes and asking, God going, well, fine, see what happens. He takes them home, they get lost, and everyone's like, okay. So it's a different discussion then about why God allows people to inflict harm on themselves and do things that he said won't be good for them. And that is a different conversation, one that would be fascinating to have. But after that point, if a lesson is to be learnt here, part of learning that lesson surely must be accepting that a mistake was made.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
that's what the church can't bring itself to do.
Correct.
And what impact is that now having, do you think, on the church? The fact that even if we can find a way that it works, that the church makes mistakes, that it works theologically, that it makes sense, that they're here to learn lessons, hard lessons, what is it that is happening to the members of the church right now because the leaders won't apologize? What impacts are you seeing from it?
Oh, I think it's holding us back. The Tabernacle Choir last year went and sang in Florida and Georgia. And when we were in Georgia, we sang in the Martin Luther King Chapel, along with the Spelman and Morehouse College Glee Clubs. These are the traditionally black colleges in Georgia. And this is where Martin Luther King studied. And the whole theme was sort of, we're embracing the brotherhood of man, and we are putting all of our racial problems behind us. And it was lovely, and I will treasure that experience for the rest of my life. At the same time, it still felt incomplete. It still felt, again, I'm going to quote Paul Reeve. He said, President Nelson kept telling us we need to root out racism in the church. He says, how do you root out something if you're not willing to look at the roots, not willing to see, well, where did this come from? Why is this racism here? And the fact that we can't, we disavow sort of the whatever and just leave it with, well, we don't know why God did this, is still leaving the door open to the fact that, well, maybe God is just a racist and we just have to accept that.
So do you think it's a more, do you think it's a more fundamental issue with the structure of the church? This idea of follow the prophet, this idea of needing to follow the prophet in all things. And if we could shift away from that, if those with their perceived power over people could maybe let go of some of it, or their perceived control could let go of it and say, well, we are here to guide you. I mean, good luck making these sorts of life decisions on your own. You probably can, but we are here to try and help.
Right.
Then all of a sudden you lose that fear, because I think some of the fear would be that, oh, well, if the prophet led us astray, which again, that comes back to the idea that prophets will never lead you astray. Russell Nelson also said that to children. Insert clip here.
Yeah.
President Nelson, would you ever lead anyone astray?
Oh, no.
That's not what prophets do, is it?
Some of them have said, if the president of the church should ever lead people astray, God would take him away. So I like to stay here, and I won't lead you astray.
But if the prophet can't lead you astray, and that's not something you want, then what happens if we admit that they did lead us astray? Even if it was to learn a lesson, even for whatever reason it was, that they led us astray, the priesthood ban was a mistake, for example, or they led us astray when it came to finances, they weren't honest with us. Is it the problem that we view prophets as someone to be followed, and therefore they can't admit to making mistakes, otherwise they worry people won't follow them anymore? And if we could reframe the way that we view them and their role in our lives as guides rather than leaders, or as guides rather than people to be absolutely followed to the letter, then it would actually be quite a natural thing to hear what they have to say, but then not have to do it. Maybe. Does that make sense?
It does. And I mean, you get snippets of that, particularly from President Oaks. President Oaks gave that great talk once about the idea of exceptions. He says, we teach general principles. You may be an exception. We don't teach the exceptions. I mean, there are sort of flashes of light that penetrate that overarching narrative, but that overarching narrative is very much, we can't lead you astray, which, just quickly, I think if you research the statement and how that statement was made back when it was first made, it becomes a promise of intent and not a promise of impact. When Brigham Young talks about not leading people astray, he always adds words like knowingly and designedly. There's a great quote where he's like, can I make a mistake? And I said, I'm very much paraphrasing this. I don't know this word for word, but it was like, I'll admit that all the day long, that I can make mistakes. But I would never knowingly or designedly lead this church one hair's breadth away from the will of God, which I think means that the promise is the prophet is always going to do what he thinks is right. He's not going to try to undermine the church from the inside. You don't have to worry about a sleeper agent being called as a prophet. That's the kind of person that the Lord would remove. If somebody is called as a prophet and their intent is to destroy the church, then I think when Wilford Woodruff says, I would be removed from my place, that I think is correct. But it doesn't mean that Moses can't wander in the wilderness for 40 years. He's leading the children of Israel, but they can't seem to get there because he's wandering along with everybody else.
But what that then impacts into, or that kind of crashes headfirst into, is that relies on us trusting that the prophet of the church, that relies on us trusting that the person leading the church has a good idea of what it means to destroy the church, because the church is the members, and currently we're seeing an exodus of members in certain parts of the world because of decisions that were made around finances, because of decisions that have caused people to lose trust in the leaders of the church. And I think we've strayed away, unfortunately, from knowingly being a good enough caveat, because they knowingly hid information from the members because they wanted people to keep paying their tithing. The
Yeah.
justification, well, the church needs to keep an income, the church needs to keep growing. So that from their perspective is perfectly justified to hide information so that people will then keep paying, because that is the greater good, is that the church keeps bringing money in so it can continue to operate, so it can subsidize the areas of the world where it's growing in poorer parts, etc., etc.
Yeah.
But the cost of that was the honesty, or the trust of members that then found out when they were found out. Um, so I think that is the problem there, is trying to determine the intent now of the leaders of the church. And I think, unfortunately, they've done things that show their intent isn't always to be honest.
Well, no, and again, that comes back to fallibility, and it comes back to the idea they thought. I mean, and you're even saying, as you described this, they thought they were doing what was best for the church, and they sort of shaved moral corners to do that.
But what is best for the church wasn't best for the members of the church.
No,
Because and the church is made up of its members. The church, and that's where I worry that, because we've got so many lawyers and businessmen, they view the church sometimes as a corporate entity, because
yeah.
it legally is, but they view it as a corporate entity and not as a collection of people. Because what's best for that corporate entity is that the revenue stream keeps going and that money keeps being made, etc.
Well,
That's not what's best for the people if that comes at the cost of being honest with them.
well, I mean, I am not in any way trying to justify what they've done there. I'm trying to say this is what fallibility is.
Yes.
It's that they can think to themselves or justify to themselves or convince themselves that what they are doing is the right thing, and they are incorrect. That it isn't the right thing. We can look at that and say that it isn't the right thing.
So when
But
that
when you
comes
talk
to light
about
that it's
trust,
incorrect.
well, but when you talk about trust and member trust, I think if the church were to own up to its mistakes, it would enhance trust.
Yeah, agreed.
Just massively enhance trust. I mean, the short term, it'd be like ripping off a Band-Aid. It'd be painful. I mean, to admit, this is the thing that we're keep bumping into right now with the sleeveless garments stuff, is that there are so many members who are upset by it. It's like, well, you're upset by it. Isn't this what you wanted? Isn't this great? Well, it's like, well, you told us that if we didn't keep our shoulders covered, that we were walking pornography. And now we discover that's not true, or that was based on nothing.
And
That
we
was
don't get
based
an
on,
apology.
I mean, yeah, I mean, it's the same thing also, like the November 2015 policy, when it was reversed. In some ways, that was almost worse, because it was, okay, here was this terrible policy, and we were all upset about it. And when I almost left the church over it. It was just so unsettling to me.
And
And it was
thousands
so,
did.
and
Mass
thousands
resignations.
did. And it was stunning to me that the minute I start, I'd spent my entire life as a very orthodox member of the church. And this was the first time publicly I started saying, wait, this is wrong, guys. This is wrong. And the first reaction from so many people was, well, then leave. We don't want you here. Get out of here. If you can't sustain the brethren, if you can't support just get out. And I'm like, really? That's our first reaction to anybody that expresses doubt, is just leave, get lost? And so I sort of struggled and kind of tried to come to terms with that and decided I was going to stay in the church. And then when it was reversed, I thought, here's the moment where we're finally going to have a conversation, because this is so clearly a mistake. This is so clearly the reversing of a mistake. We have no choice now but to sort of confront the reality of that. And it was, no, we don't. That was a revelation then. This is a revelation now. God changed his mind. Off we go. The day after, I've started using the name of the general authority that I met with, because he's since passed away. The day after the policy was reversed, Robert Reynolds, who was the director of An Inconvenient Faith, he and I had a meeting with Tad Callister. Do you know Tad Callister?
Mm-hmm. Infinite Atonement, right?
We went to his home. My brother-in-law knew him personally and said, "Hey, you should get Tad Callister in your documentary." And we'd love to have Tad Callister in a documentary. And so we go and we met with him. And it was very clear within seconds, really, that he wasn't going to be in the documentary.
Right.
But we had a lengthy conversation with him, and the policy came up. And he said, Jesus told his disciples to go without purse or scrip. And then 3 years later, told them that they would have to take purse or scrip. This happens all the time. This is the way God works all the time. He just changes. The circumstances just change. And that was it. It was just this sort of glib dismissal of, oh, well, see, this is just like Jesus. And I'm just like, first of all, what's changed? Because when Jesus said, don't take purse or scrip, he said, now take purse or scrip because I'm going to die and I'm going to be gone and you're in charge of the church. And so you don't have me here.
I can't multiply loaves and fishes for you anymore.
Yeah. I mean, so it's very clearly a reason why there's a change. The only thing that changed between 2015 and the reversal in 2019 was the outrage of the members who saw this as being in violation of so many of the church's core principles. The idea that we're judged for our own sins, not for the sins of anybody else. The idea that we should suffer the little children to come unto me and the little, all of this, and we're going to punish these children because of who their parents are. It was just so antithetical to everything I'd ever been taught. And nothing changed in the world outside. What changed was the members were outraged by it. And, President Nelson gave a talk about it, and he didn't apologize, but he did acknowledge that it caused pain. And it's like, well, if it caused pain and you've changed it, then it was a mistake. Why can't we just say it was a mistake? We made a mistake. And we can't seem to be able to do that. And what that does is it erodes trust. Because so many people, when I wrote my CES letter reply, the thing that it did, that it was helpful to, was not, it didn't convince terrible apostates, didn't convince Jeremy Runnels to come running back to the church. And it didn't convince anybody that wanted to leave the church not to leave the church. What it did was provide a way for people who wanted to stay to be able to stay. This idea of, because so many people who encounter all these terrible things or difficult things, their first reaction is not, oh, well, I'm gone. I really wanted to sin, so this is my opportunity. Now I can go out and live it up. It's, how do I stay? How do I stay? I want to stay. I found so much divinity and wonderful things in the church, and now I'm bumping into this terrible thing. How do I stay? How do I trust the church? And if the church were able to say, well, we messed up, and that's kind of what mortality is. We're very sorry. And, we counsel members of the church to do that, to admit their mistakes, but institutionally, we can't bring ourselves to do that. Then it's like, this church doesn't trust me enough to admit when it's wrong. So how can I trust it back?
Exactly. And unfortunately, your response to the CES letter shouldn't be necessary. You shouldn't be the one. It's not your job to fix that for people, right? The church should be able to point to everything that's raised in the CS letter and just apologize that we hadn't addressed these things. We're sorry that we hadn't talked about this. We're sorry that we hid these things from you. We're sorry that we denied these things that turned out to be true. Sorry about that. That was a mistake. And our pledge moving forward is to be more transparent. For example, look at the Joseph Smith papers. Look at that wonderful project that is an attempt. They could certainly frame as an attempt to be far more transparent about the church's history. Say, hey, look, we're making all these documents available publicly.
Yeah.
because we want to be more transparent about our history, and that sort of intention of moving forward in a way that's improved, with the acknowledgement that they need to improve because things weren't right, is the key. And they're not willing to do that second part. They're not willing to admit that things were wrong. Like with the garments, they're like, okay, no, we are. What really matters to God is that you're wearing a sacred reminder of your temple covenants. What doesn't matter to him so much is whether you show your shoulder or not. That is the new position of the church, it would
Right.
seem. We
Right.
are sorry that for the harm and the pain caused to young women who were shamed, who were made to wear large baggy t-shirts at dances, who were told they were walking pornography, to men who were made to feel incredibly insecure. We're sorry about that. We were doing our best with the information we had. It's, however they want to frame it, I don't really care particularly. They will frame it however they want to frame it. It's not my job to write that for them. Shouldn't be your job to fix this either. They should be adults and be able to take responsibility for the mistakes they make as fallible people like the rest of us.
Right.
And if they personally view themselves as fallible people, then where is this disconnect? Maybe that's what people should talk about in the comments. Where is this disconnect between them acknowledging themselves as fallible individuals and believing that every decision they make on behalf of the church can never be apologized for?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And the Joseph Smith Papers is actually a great example of this. I mean, because I think it's hard to overstate just what an act of transparency that is. Now, most members of the church don't care enough or aren't interested enough and don't recognize the breadth and the scope of this, and that's fine. But it demonstrates that the church really is trying to move in that direction. And the reason why I'm confident that we're going to get there, that if it's not President Oaks giving us a Nixon to China moment, that eventually we have to get there, is that things that are unsustainable have to stop. And this, we cannot sustain long term this sort of facade of infallibility, this attempt to sort of prop up, mistakes were made. I mean, that's the political phrase. I think it's also the phrase in the SEC statement, we regret mistakes made. A politician that says mistakes were made is not taking accountability. They're not saying, I made a mistake, I'm sorry for my mistake. They're just, we keep thinking as a church that we have a choice. That we have a choice as to whether or not we will address all of this, that we have a choice as to whether or not we're going to own up to our mistakes. Ultimately, long term, we don't. We really don't have a choice because the information is all out there. The internet has democratized reality to the point where anybody can go back and find Brigham Young saying, yeah, the law of God will always be that an interracial couple should be put to death on the spot. Well, how do you reconcile that? Well, you reconcile that by saying Brigham Young was horribly wrong. That's how you reconcile that. Well, no, it was a problem. Then sooner or later we have to let go of the false doctrine, and it is a false doctrine of prophetic infallibility. We have to let it go because it can't be sustained over time. The church cannot survive long term. It's done a great job. It's never going to go away because it's got more money than God and will be able to survive somehow. But the church as a relevant institution in the lives of its members, until we're eventually going to have to own up to all of this. You can't escape reality.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. I'll make my final point here before we go, which is I think not only do they not have a choice, but to have to confront this and have to let go of the idea of infallibility. I think what they're going to have to do is they're going to have to embrace fallibility. I think they're going to have to positively embrace it and just own it. And as they own it, people will trust them because they will trust that they will acknowledge mistakes when mistakes are made. Because no one's perfect. No one's looking for someone perfect. And we need to get rid of that expectation. If we need to change, follow the prophet, take it out of the children's hymn book, fine. It was always a little bit creepy anyway. So we'll just get rid of it.
It sounds like the Simpsons Stonecutter song.
Yes, it does. It absolutely does. So thank you very much, Jim. Thanks for joining me. and for this great discussion. For those that want to hear the opening part, I will remind you, you can head to Patreon now and get yourself signed up there, where you can hear me and Jim chat nonsense about singing and music and all that other stuff as well. If you like this video, there's a button specifically for that. And make sure to check out my appearance on the Inside Out podcast with Jim Bennett and Ian Wilkes. I had a great time. I'm looking forward to joining them again. Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you, Nemo. Appreciate it.
No worries. Take care, everyone, and I'll see you on the next one.